Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Loretta Garcia. I'm the host for today's Contemporary Issues Forum. I want to first summarize the next program we have, which is on March 27th. Let me just pull this up. And the speaker for that program is Reverend, do I have it? Reverend Sarah Anders, and she is from the, I didn't write where she's from. She's going to be speaking on spirituality in nature, and she is the minister at a local congregation here in the area that meets out in the woods and connects with nature. We are going to make a tie between that and our UU 7th principle, which is a respect for the interconnected web of all existence of which we are a part. And the host for that one will be John Nowick. Our speaker for today is Yunior Gomez, and our backup is Jim Mulholland. Yunior is Director of Programs in El Salvador for the Companion Community Development Alternatives, known as COCODA. Many of you know that River Road has a longstanding commitment to El Salvador going back to the war years in the 90s. And after the peace accord was signed in the early 90s, we set up annual delegations to El Salvador to assist with redevelopment in the areas. Yunior basically grew up in Santa Marta, one of the communities where we had a connection. And then he became employed with COCODA, and now he is director of the programs in El Salvador and Nicaragua. And today he's going to be talking to us about the water development that they have in the area. Now, I assume he has had difficulty connecting. I still don't see that he's come on. So we have with us Jim Mulholland, who is the director of the stateside programs for COCODA. Jim, if you can unmute yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself and maybe a little bit about COCODA. And then, let me make one announcement I forgot. Excuse me, Jim. So the next program I announced, we also have some open spaces in April and May. And I'm inviting anyone who has either themselves or someone they know who has an interesting and contemporary, exciting issue that can present to this forum. If you can contact either me or Kim and Carl Weichel or anyone on the committee who are Dale Miller Hill, Aidan Jones, of course, longtime founder and longtime member Nancy Cedar, Aidan Jones, Dale, so I mentioned Dale, who else? Rob Neuter, Jan Polisar. If you can contact any of us and let us know of your topic and speaker, we meet as a committee quarterly, and we can discuss those issues and bring on some new speakers. Also, if you'd like to join our committee, we'd be happy to invite you for that as well. Okay, so I am going to mute myself. I'll spotlight Jim Mulholland, and then we can have him do the presentation. I do have the presentation loaded, so if Yunior has not joined us at that point.
All right, well, very good to be with you. I'm very sorry that Yunior has not been able to connect. Unfortunately, in El Salvador, the internet sometimes is difficult, so that's not unusual for this to happen. First of all, I want to just thank River Road for all those years of support and all of the things that you've done to support our programs and to support the people of El Salvador. And I know Ahmed, I see you, and I see Don. I know both of you have been heavily involved, so appreciate both of you and glad to meet the rest of you.
And just mention
Oh,
that my daughter Julie Elfin also went on one of the delegations,
oh,
and myself
terrific,
also.
terrific, terrific. So my guess is all of you have had some touch with COCODA over the years, and probably even some before I was director. Um, just a word about me. I got involved with COCODA back in the mid 90s as a volunteer, eventually became part of the board, and then about 8 years ago became the director. And I am the only US employee of COCODA. All the rest of our staff are Central American. And about 5 years ago, we expanded into Nicaragua. So now we do many of the same things that we do in El Salvador and Nicaragua. Certainly a country with a very similar history, unfortunately, with the United States and with United States interventions. So, and some of the same reparations that need to be made, often in poor rural communities. So, if you know about COCODA, one of our key priorities, philosophies, is that what we do should be generated by the communities. So we are very careful in making sure that what we do is what they have identified as priority. And this means that when we first started working, we built houses, we helped with land reform, because when they came back from the war, that was the most basic need. We've worked on agriculture when that was important. When schools were important, we focused on helping building schools. When scholarships to university then became an issue, we've helped with that. Obviously in public health, when those were the priorities. So rather than being an organization that focuses on one specific kind of work, really it's much more collaborative. And as the communities develop their priorities and needs, then we try to identify resources and partners to respond to that. One of the things that began to rise to the top of communities' priorities back around 2000 was water. And that many of the communities were still having to walk down to a spring or a well, get the water and bring it back. And often in these rural communities, that would take sometimes 2, 3, or 4 hours of women and children's time on a specific day, just in terms of obtaining water sufficient for drinking and for other uses. So as communities came to us, the way it works is, if you're a community that is above the water source, you have an issue, because if your community is below the water source, that's fairly easy. You create a containment tank and you use gravity to bring the water down to the communities. Unfortunately, most rural communities, they're not above or below the water source, they're above the water source. So the question is how to get that water up that hill or ravine or canyon in some cases, and get it to a place where it can be distributed out to the village. And of course, that needs energy. Our first projects were electrical projects, but that's a big problem in El Salvador. One, because the electrical grid is inconsistent, and there were times when the grid would go down for a week or two. So if you're suddenly not able to get water, you're back to walking down to that source. The other thing about electricity is it's expensive. And so for these communities, that was really a challenge as they tried to find the wherewithal to pay for the electricity. And finally, often getting the electricity down to the water source, if it was in a canyon or gulch or at the bottom of a big hill, was really expensive in capital costs to run those poles down to where the pump would need to be. So in 2010, we began to look at solar power. And Loretta, if you want to launch that PowerPoint, I can kind of walk us through that.
We are trying to bring that up for you, Jim. Let me just, there, okay, now we see it. Okay. It should come on momentarily.
Okay. If you want to go to, let's skip through these first 4, because we've kind of said much of what was in the first 4 slides.
That's why I was
Let's
trying
go
to
down.
I was trying to bring it up for you.
Terrific. Just one more, please.
One more? Okay.
Okay. Yeah, so I want to talk today a little bit about the advantages of a solar-powered water pumping system and why that is changing the world in Central America, and it's certainly changing the situation in many countries, where especially where the sun is a powerful source. In El Salvador, they have sun for about 10 hours a day, strong sun, and only have about 2 weeks during any given year when they don't have a pretty strong sun. So it's a great resource, much better than it even here in North America. Loretta, you want to move forward? So again, it's simple and effective. It just uses the sun and uses panels to bring energy. There is no need to be connected to the electrical grid. If you want to move forward. It's, in terms of design, it's basically panels and then a inverter that takes the DC and makes it into AC. And here you can kind of see a picture of that. So the panels are connected to that inverter, which runs a pump that pumps it up to a distribution tank, where then it can be fed out to the community. And one of the also great advantages, it doesn't use batteries. It uses that distribution tank to essentially hold the energy. So solar panels can produce the energy to power the pump. And there's an example of the solar panels from a project in Nicaragua. This is the inverter. Basically takes that DC current from the solar panels and converts it into AC current. Probably the most complicated and most expensive piece of equipment, but pretty amazing in what it does. And then a pump, which is collecting the water down in at the spring at a containment tank, and then during the day when those panels are operating, pumping the water up to the distribution tank. This picture is fun because if you can go back, Loretta, this picture is fun. This man was from the first project in Zacatecas dos. He was our biggest skeptic, just simply thought this would never work. And here he is kind of holding the pump. The system was extremely successful, and now he is one of the biggest advocates of this. But I love this picture because he was the guy that said, you know, I can't see how this is going to work. So if you want to go forward, Loretta. So this is what a distribution tank would look like. This is one in Nicaragua, and it's just at the highest point, and it allows gravity then to distribute water to each of the homes. So it's essentially a water tower. And it's also at that distribution tank that we have treatment. And here is actually a place where the chlorine is added. In some of our new projects, we're actually looking at using ultraviolet light in doing purification, but chlorine is the basic way to clean the water at this point. And then one thing that's really important we've learned in water systems is there's a water meter, just like here in the United States, at each home. And this way, you really can help the community conserve. One of the things that we learned is giving people free water is a really bad idea. Two things. One is there's no conservation when water is free. So people use it for feeding their animals, for irrigation. They use it for all the kinds of things that tax the system. The other thing about a water meter is it allows you to evenly distribute the responsibility of keeping the system going to all of the communities. So everyone pays a small fee into the system. And then it ends up with one water faucet. So we're not talking about bringing water for bathrooms and bathtubs and showers. It's basically bringing a water faucet to a pila where they can collect water for themselves. So when the sun is out, the pump is operating, and solar does still pump on cloudy days, not at quite the highest levels, but continues to work. It's not affected by power outages. It's an automatic off and on. So when the sun comes up, it begins to work. When the sun goes down, it stops. And where there already is an electrical system, we can actually do a parallel where if they absolutely need to, they can use electricity, but they can primarily depend on the solar power. So We can skip this. We can skip this slide, Loretta. So simple maintenance. Solar panels warranty for about 25 years. All you have to do is clean them occasionally. The rest of the system is all locally procured components, the pumps, everything else. So if anything goes wrong, they can fix it. And the other thing solar power does, and this was kind of unexpected, is it's much less wear and tear on the pumps. So we're discovering the pumps tend to last about 4 to 5 years longer because they don't have that constant on and off that puts the most damage and onto a pump. Here's the inverter. It's one of the more complicated, as I said, but it's part of the reason they're paying those fees is so they can put money aside, and when that unit runs out, they'll have the money to replace it. So effective examples all over the world. It's cost effective in the long term, but I think the key piece is the autonomy that a solar powered system gives a community. Essentially, they control their own small company, water company for their community. They're the ones that make all the decisions. They set the prices, they maintain and improve the system. So you really are giving them an incredible amount of autonomy. So we have done so far solar powered systems 4 in El Salvador, Zacamil Dos, El Rodeo, Aguacayo, El Roble, and then in Nicaragua, Zacatalosa. And we are presently getting ready to do 2 more. One that will be a large system in El Salvador that serves 10 communities, including La Mora, which some of you may know from visits there. It's where the clinic is that we support. And then also doing a new system in Nicaragua. You can forward through this one. So I want to tell you about the last project we did. It was completed in January of 2020. And for about $60,000, we brought water to the community of Zacatalosa, Nicaragua, about 70 families, probably about 300 people. And these pictures will show you a little bit about that project. So here's the construction of the containment tank. And this is the spring. And basically, they're creating a tank that contains that water as it comes out of the spring. And then this water will be sent to another tank where the pump will be. And here's where they're constructing that collection tank. So this tank has to be deep because this is where all that water from the catchment tank is going to go and be stored for the pump. And then you got to dig the lines from that distribution tank. You can go ahead, that's fine, Loretta, that next slide. So then you got to dig, sorry, back to that slide of them digging if you can. Perfect. Then you have to dig a trench from the bottom where that collection tank is all the way up the hill to where that distribution tank is. In Zacatalosa, that was almost a mile, and it was pretty much straight up the hill. What I loved about it is in 2 days, they brought 40 men and they dug that complete line in 2 days. They did it in a way that did not disturb a single tree. Had to dig it about a foot deep, ran all the pipe and completed that system and did it all by hand. If you want to forward, Loretta, we can see that. So there it is, nearly 1 mile, 1 meter, 40 villagers, 2 days, number of trees destroyed, 0. So it was fun when I went to the inauguration. I said, well, where's the distribution line? Because here in the United States, we would have taken a bulldozer down that hill and it'd be pretty obvious where the distribution line is. I couldn't find it because it had already grown over and it was completely covered up. Next slide. Yeah, this is that big blue tank you saw. This is them building it. It's really interesting. It's mostly rock that they collected and brought up there. They create these walls, put the rock in, and then finish it with cement. And then this is perhaps the most amazing story. When they got it all done, they needed to test it to make sure it would cure correctly. So they spent several days bringing bucket after bucket of water up to pour in that tank. by hand so they could test it. So pretty impressive. And there it is. That's the tank after it was completed. And here we are at the inauguration when we're celebrating it. And just, you know, they painted it. It's beautiful. And you can see where the, right there in front, you can see where the purification system is. That box is where you put the chlorine in. And here's the solar array that was at the bottom of the hill. That's where they're collecting the energy for the pump. And here's the celebration where we're cutting the ribbon and celebrating with the community, the completion of this project. The inauguration was truly incredible. All of the people were there. They were dressed up and they had brought in music and we danced and ate a meal together and gave too many speeches, and it was really a grand experience. But I want to tell you one quick story. After lunch, we walked down to the spring with some of the Central Americans. And when we got to the bottom, I noticed that none of the Central American women had come with us. And I mentioned that. And one of the older men just laughed and said, he said, my mother's been coming down here since she was a baby. And, you know, she's 78 years old and she's never coming back down here if she never has to. And it was interesting when I got home, I kind of just figured out how many trips she'd made. 78 years, 365 days a year you went down to the spring, that she had made 25,000 trips down that hill to get water. And that was just a pretty amazing thing to me. Next slide. So here's what's pretty exciting. When we did that first project with Zacamel Dos in 2010, the costs for the solar panels were $6,000. In 2017, when we did another project, they were $1,500. In 2021, actually that should read 20, the cost was $750. And that's, it's kind of leveled off because of the pandemic. The pricing for panels has kind of not been decreasing as much, but still just gives you an idea of how much cheaper it is to do these kinds of projects. So this is what these projects do. They create autonomy and community control. There's independence from the electrical company. The community owns and controls their water. The community makes decisions about access, pricing, and improvements. So you can put that down, Loretta, and I think the rest of our time can just be some discussions, some questions, and I can tell you a little bit about these systems and what we're working on now, and just about the impact that these systems are having. So I don't know if people want to unmute and ask a question or put it in the chat. I can read it in the chat, whichever is best for people.
Sorry, I thought I was unmuted. So what we normally do is have people put questions in the chat, and I should have mentioned that at the beginning. But if anybody let me look in the chat and see. Okay, we don't have anything in the chat.
I did. I sent them to you.
Oh, okay. I was controlling the visual. Since we have you on audio, Chris, you want to ask your questions directly to Jim Mulholland?
Sure. First of all, thanks to Don, we met with Yunior a while ago. He is such an amazingly impressive young man.
Yes, he is.
And one thing he said was that it brought water for the first time to one indigenous community. That may be the one you talked about.
Correct.
And one of my questions is, does the meter help identify any possible leakages in the system? Because, you know, when it starts to, you know, go up pretty rapidly.
Right. That's true in the United States as well, Chris. So good point. Yeah. You know, that's another way of testing if there are problems in the lines. That's pretty unusual for there to be problems there. You know, they don't have the cold, hot issues that we have, which is what's hard sometimes on our plumbing. So much less likely to have breakage, but yeah, that would help with that as well. The meter would help with that.
Great. Chris, did you have another question?
No, that was really it. I still want to say how impressed I was with the work that Yunior was doing and the work that COCODA has been doing.
Thank you.
Have you had any other contact with that indigenous community. As you said, I think first time they'd ever had water.
Right. Well, part of our model, Chris, is that we connect to communities rather than do projects. So the community of Zactoloso is a community that we initially did the construction of a school. That was the first project with them. They didn't have a school, and we partnered with the government, the municipality, and helped build a school there. The second initiative we did with them was a composting latrine initiative, where we put in a series of composting latrines at the school and some other spots in the community. And both of those were also ways to test the community's leadership capacity, because a water system is a pretty complicated and challenging endeavor. So after they did well with those two, we did the water system. And when I say we, I want to also make clear that we were working with a Nicaraguan NGO. So it's not us working with the community around an NGO, but through an NGO, because we want to build capacity with the NGOs as well. And then out of all of that, we established a scholarship program, because in that community, their schooling ended at 8th grade. And so we now have a scholarship program that helps kids go to high school. And in fact, they now have their first student, probably the first child from that school or that community to go to university, who's in nursing school. So in other words, we don't do a project and then leave the community. We continue building these relationships as they identify new priorities. So in El Salvador, we work with about 15 to 20 communities that we've been working with for almost 30 years. And in Nicaragua now we're up to about 4 communities that we're working with consistently.
Great, thank you. And Hamid, I think, is the next one with a question. Hamid, if you unmute yourself, you can go ahead and ask your question to Mr. Mulholland.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and good afternoon, Mr. Mulholland. You and I have a lot in common. I have bald head just like yours. Okay. Well, sir, first a small question. The picture that you have behind you, what street of Xochitoto is that? Number one. Number two, you mentioned that the total cost dollar-wise, not labor-wise, is about $60,000 for one water project. How much money do you need to get a project started? And what are the various sources where that money comes from? And the last thing I want to inform you that I am from Pakistan, and my grandmothers and grandaunts and so forth, they walked on the level ground, not on the hilly ground, for equal number of trips to get to bring the water home.
Yeah.
And the water pump that you show, my family uses it to pump the water 50 feet above in the land they have. And over there, they expect life expectancy to be about 40 years, but who knows? Anyway, thank you, sir, for your work.
Okay, Ahmed, and thanks for your donations in the past. Very much appreciate that. The street behind me is the street behind the church. So we're looking at the back of the church there in Xochitoto. There's a good pupuseria right down here in the corner, and that's probably why that picture was taken there. So in terms of your first question, which I think was about the whole issue of where the funds come from and how the cost of this. Yeah, it's about $60,000, which sounds like a lot, but when you think about this giving them water for 25 years for so many families, I think in Zactoloso we figured it out that we were investing about $25 a person over the life of that time every year to keep that water system. So it's really, when you think about the long term, that 60,000 is not very much for what you're providing. In terms of the sources of income or sources of revenue for these projects, the community provides all of the in-kind labor. So in Zactoloso, they dug all those lines. They helped construct all of that. So that really helps bring down the costs. But again, there are certain costs for all of those panels, for the electrical work. We do hire solar engineers in country to help with that, so that we're helping the economy there. And then there's just some costs that running all of that distribution pipe, that's a considerable amount of money, and paying for all of that piping. In terms of sources, Rotary International has been a tremendous support for us. One of their goals is clean water across the world. So in many of these projects, Rotary clubs provide as much as 50 or 60% of the funding. Then it's also funding that comes from organizations like River Road and other churches, foundations, and then individuals. A lot of individuals are committed to these water systems and make donations. $500 here, $1,000 there to make these systems work. So what's really exciting is over the last 5 years, we've been doing these sun and water conferences. And I know Don and Sinali Roy attended one about 5 years ago. And then I think a couple people, we did a virtual one just this last spring, and I can't remember who was there from River Road, but I think there was at least one person. And so these are kind of projects or conferences where we present the projects, and then we use about 9 months to raise the money. So one of the things I'm excited about, used to be COCODA would do one water system every 4 or 5 years, just because it was so hard to do that. Now we're at a scale where, every couple of years we're doing 3 or 4. So we've really been able to increase the scale of systems. And we still have a lot of communities that still would like to have the solar powered water system.
Great. And Jim, would you please share, I know you have a couple of other initiatives, education and healthcare. Would you share a little bit about that? And then I'll ask Don Cherry if he wants to make any comments about the work we've done there.
Okay, great. Yeah, water and sanitation, which involves composting latrines, is one of our initiatives, simply because communities have identified those as important right now. Second, education is one of our initiatives, which used to be building schools. If you go back 20 years ago, that's what we were doing. Now, all of it is really involved in scholarships. And so we run 3 scholarship programs, 2 in Nicaragua, 1 in El Salvador, that send probably in the range of 50 to 60 young people either to high school or college. So those are one of our initiatives. In public health, we support a clinic community clinic in El Salvador, the La Mora Clinic. And we also have a collaboration with Indiana University, where they send doctors and medical students down to collaborate in the Suchitoto area. We also bring doctors from Suchitoto area here to the United States for continuing education. We do continuing education programs with people there. And the IU program also buys equipment for midwives, clinics, and medications, things like that. So that's kind of how we do the public health end of what we're working on.
Great, thank you. And Don Cherry, do you have any comments you want to make about the work you've done? I know Don has been involved since the war years. And would you like to make any comments, Don?
Well, thanks a lot. Thanks for filling in, Jim, for Junior. He has been on during your programs that you had the past week.
Right.
Yeah. So he did make it in there. We're really involved with delegations to El Salvador for, I guess, about 17 years, I think we did it. And for an immersion experience, Jim talks about that being the way to participate in the communities and really understand the life in the communities that we were visiting. And also we were really involved with the education and particularly through the scholarship program with AUDIS, which basically supports people like Junior who went to the university and got his English there, and then many others that are now nurses, doctors, and participating in the society quite productively. So I think we're proud of the contributions we made to the education programs. And I think as when COVID gets behind us, or we cope with it, that we can return to delegations and to supporting the education programs from River Road. I look forward to trying to get that going again.
Thank you.
That's it.
Thank you. And then I see, Hamid, your hand is raised. Do you have another question?
Yes, Jim, I want to take this opportunity to pass on one idea to you. El Salvador is not Pakistan. Pakistan is completely flat. And these kind of projects over there make the human and the animal feces penetrate through the water system. And as such, something called the Cryptosporidium has produced awful lot of hepatitis A and B and C and what have you. I ask you to keep that thing in mind, that these water tanks, once in 3 months, they must be tested by the proper microbiologists once in 3 months and so forth. And I know these things will be quite good because they are on the hilltops, and the feces do not travel uphill, as they do in. So anyway, end of my story.
No, Ahmed, that's thank you for bringing that out. That's one of the reasons we've been pushing the composting latrines, is because the other kind of latrine systems seep into the water table. So it's I think that's a really good point. The good thing in El Salvador, at least, Nicaragua is not quite as good, but in El Salvador, they actually have public health workers who come around to all of the water systems once a month and test. So and that's government required. So, and that's not through the COCODA, not even through the NGOs, it's through the government. So, and we're always obviously in communication with them. And if, for instance, in El Roble, we discovered that there was some contaminants, and it was because of a cattle operation that was just kind of up the hill from the well. And so there was obviously something getting into the system, and they've been able to rectify that some and do some mitigation. But thank you for pointing that out. It's not as simple as just throwing the water system in. I mean, you continue to have to guard the area around the spring. If you deforest it, that can cause some huge problems. You have to continue to test the water. You have to continue to clean things. That those distribution tanks have to be periodically cleaned. So there's a lot of things for the community to be responsible for.
Great. Then I see one more
Yeah.
question from Chris Hager. If you can go ahead and ask your question, Chris.
Yeah, at our dinner with Yunior, I think, and you can correct me, Loretta or Don, he said that one of the biggest ways that they collected money to support programs was the people going on delegations. And that because of COVID and other restrictions, that had dried up. But we were suggesting that maybe more people could contribute more money on Zoom or other ways, because they wouldn't have to pay for their transportation or their housing. What have you done like that to compensate for not having, I think you started to talk about it some, for not having the delegations?
Thanks, Chris. That's a great question. So when the pandemic happened, and we fortunately had been working on this, if you go back 10 years, about 80% of COCODA's income came from delegations. So people would go down, and a portion of that money would come back for operations. And then about 8 years ago, there was the Zika crisis in Central America. You may remember that. Well, we lost a year of delegations, and that was very traumatic for us as an organization, but it was a good warning. So we our board began to work very carefully to begin to wean us from our dependence on delegations. So fortunately, when the pandemic started, we were up to about only 25% of our income coming through delegation income. But that was still a big chunk. And so the last 2.5 years, the board has worked really hard to fill that gap. And the good news is this year, we will finally be 100% independent of delegations, which means that next year, fingers crossed, when we begin to take people back, the money generated from delegations can go immediately into projects and other kinds of things, where in the past, that had to come in to handle operations. So for instance, we just last week completed, or this past week, had our virtual Febrero Fiesta, and that was done on Zoom. And as of today, we've raised $22,000 through that effort. So yeah, so Junior was right. We were having to learn quickly how to transition, and the good news is I think we've made a lot of progress on that change and shift.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Jim, for stepping in. I'm sorry that you all were not able to meet Yunior today, but he prepared that presentation that Jim talked from. And I just want to mention one last thing about collaboration. When we sell our products at River Road from Equal Exchange, part of that money goes back into the El Salvador programs. So it all connects, it all works together. Thank you very much, and everybody have a great week.
Okay, you too. Good to be with all of you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim.